Samantha's request for a cruise came one evening as Louis sat on their plush living room couch, flipping through channels with a lukewarm cup of coffee. Her voice was soft yet tinged with exhaustion, as if carrying the weight of her words. "I've been thinking," she began, glancing out the large bay window where the sunset bathed their suburban neighborhood in amber hues. "I need a break." Louis lowered the remote and turned to her, concern etching faint lines on his forehead. "A break from what?" "Work," she said quickly, then hesitated. "And everything else. The deadlines, the constant meetings. It's all becoming too much." Her voice wavered, and she caught herself before her vulnerability showed too plainly. Samantha always prided herself on being unshakable. Louis nodded, his concern deepening. He knew her job as a senior marketing executive was demanding. Late nights, incessant calls, and a stream of deadlines had chipped away at her over the past year. "What do you need?" he asked, genuinely wanting to help. Her eyes darted toward him, then back to her hands folded in her lap. "The girls at work are planning a cruise. Just a week. It's a chance to unwind, reconnect with myself." "A cruise?" he repeated, caught off guard. "Yes." She leaned forward, her voice gaining conviction. "A luxury cruise. Somewhere warm, somewhere far from emails and phone calls. It's been in the works for a while. I just didn't want to bring it up until I was sure I could go." Louis's mind churned. The idea seemed innocent enough, friends, relaxation, but there was something in her tone that unsettled him. It wasn't merely the idea of her leaving. It was the urgency in her request, as though she were desperate for an escape. "Who's going?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Samantha listed a few names, colleagues he had vaguely heard of during her anecdotes about work. None of them struck him as suspicious, and yet, a faint unease lingered. "I know it's last minute," she continued, "but I need this, Louis. For my sanity." He studied her face, the faint creases around her eyes, the lines of tension that had grown more pronounced over the months. Trust was the foundation of their marriage, and he had no reason to doubt her sincerity. She had never given him a reason to. "Of course," he said after a pause. "If this is what you need, go for it. Just promise me you'll actually relax and not spend half the time checking emails." Relief washed over her face, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Thank you," she said, placing her hand over his. The conversation shifted back to their routine, dinner plans, bills, the children's schedules, but the undercurrent of Samantha's request lingered in Louis's thoughts. It was a small tug, barely noticeable, like a faint ripple in still water. In the following days, Samantha seemed lighter, almost buoyant, as she finalized her plans. She mentioned the destinations: Caribbean islands, white sands, and turquoise waters. She casually discussed the amenities of the cruise ship, the spa treatments, and the activities she and her friends had lined up. Louis listened, reassured by her enthusiasm. He even helped her pick out a new set of luggage and drove her to the airport the morning she left. "Have fun," he said as she kissed him goodbye. "And come back recharged." "I will," she promised, her smile radiant yet fleeting, as though her thoughts were already on the journey ahead. As Louis drove home, he couldn't shake the faint echo of something in her voice, a whisper of unease buried beneath her excitement. Still, he pushed it aside, telling himself he was being overprotective. Samantha deserved this break. Trust, after all, was the bedrock of their life together, or so he told himself. When Samantha returned from the cruise, she was glowing. Louis noticed it immediately as he stood waiting at the airport terminal. Her skin was kissed by the sun, her hair seemed lighter, and her smile held a sharpness that he couldn't quite place. She hugged him, but something about the embrace felt off. It lacked the warmth he had missed during her week away. Still, he brushed it off, chalking it up to jet lag or the adjustment back to their everyday life. The first few days after her return passed uneventfully, but Louis couldn't ignore the small shifts in her behavior. Samantha seemed preoccupied, her phone glued to her hand more than usual. She was quieter, often lost in thought, and when he asked how the cruise had been, she was unusually vague. "It was nice. Relaxing," she said over dinner one night, her fork picking aimlessly at her salad. "Nice? Come on, you were gone for a whole week." "Give me something," Louis pressed, smiling to mask his frustration. She glanced up, her smile tight. It's just what I needed. The girls were fun, the ship was amazing, and the weather was perfect. Her words felt rehearsed, like a speech she had practiced to avoid giving too much away. Louis let it slide, though a sliver of doubt took root in his mind. It wasn't long before Samantha started spending more time away from home. I'm meeting up with friends, she'd say, throwing on a dress that seemed a little too fitted for casual get-togethers. She hadn't cared much about her wardrobe before the cruise, usually defaulting to comfortable jeans or leggings. But now, it was like she had discovered a new self, a self that required immaculate makeup and spritzes of perfume every time she stepped out. At first, Louis didn't question it. She had always been independent, and her need for socializing wasn't unusual. But the frequency of these outings soon became impossible to ignore. You're going out again? Louis asked one Friday evening as Samantha stood in front of the mirror, dabbing on lipstick. She met his eyes in the reflection, her expression unreadable. Yes. The girls wanted to grab drinks. It's been a while. It hasn't been a while. You just went out 2 nights ago. Her hand paused, but only for a moment. Is it a problem? I didn't think I needed permission to see my friends. It's not that, Louis said quickly, but the sting of her words lingered. I miss you. You've been so busy since you got back. She sighed, turning to face him. I'm not doing anything wrong, Louis. Can I have some space without being interrogated? Her tone silenced him, but it didn't ease the growing knot in his stomach. He watched as she slipped on her heels and walked out the door, her phone buzzing in her hand. That phone. It had become an extension of her since the cruise. She kept it close, even in the house, often typing away with a small, private smile on her lips. She used to leave it lying around, but now it was always either in her pocket or clutched in her hand. At night, she placed it face down on the nightstand, and on more than one occasion, Louis caught her angling it away when notifications popped up. The shift in her behavior didn't just affect her time away. It seeped into their interactions at home. Conversations were shorter, her attention divided. When they watched TV together, she seemed distracted, her eyes flickering to her phone every few minutes. When he asked her opinion on something, her responses were delayed, as if she hadn't fully heard him. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Louis glanced over at her. She was scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the screen. What's so interesting? He asked, keeping his tone light. Just catching up on messages, she replied without looking up. From who? Work. Friends, she said curtly. Can't I have friends? The defensiveness in her voice caught him off guard. Of course you can. I was just asking. She sighed, putting the phone down, but not before locking the screen. You're being paranoid. Maybe you should find a hobby instead of watching me all the time. Her words cut deeper than she probably intended, but Louis said nothing. The tension in the room was palpable, and he felt humiliated for even bringing it up. Was he overreacting? Maybe she was right. Maybe he was being paranoid. But as the days turned into weeks, the unease gnawed at him like a relentless tide. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. Samantha had left early, claiming she was meeting friends for brunch. Hours passed, and Louis found himself pacing the house, his mind spinning with unanswered questions. She hadn't called, and her replies to his texts were brief and evasive. When she finally returned, the sun was beginning to set. She walked in carrying a shopping bag, her cheeks flushed. Sorry, brunch ran late. We ended up shopping afterward, she said breezily, dropping the bag on the counter. Louis stared at her, trying to mask his frustration. You didn't think to call? I didn't realize I had to check in with you every hour, she shot back, her voice laced with irritation. It's not about checking in. It's about being considerate. Considerate, she repeated, laughing humorlessly. You're acting like I've committed a crime. The argument spiraled from there, with accusations and defenses flying back and forth. For the first time, Louis found himself doubting the foundation of their relationship. The woman standing before him, bristling with defiance, felt like a stranger. That night, as Samantha slept soundly beside him, her phone buzzed quietly on the nightstand. Louis stared at the device, his heart pounding. The urge to pick it up was overwhelming, But he stopped himself. If he crossed that line, there would be no going back. Instead, he lay awake, the chasm between them growing wider with every passing moment. Something had changed on that cruise, something he couldn't ignore. And as much as he wanted to believe her, the gnawing doubt refused to let go. Louis had started to see his days as divided into two distinct parts: the moments when Samantha was home but distant, and the times she wasn't home at all. Each part brought its own form of torment. At least when she was out, his suspicions could stew in private. But when she was present, the silence between them spoke louder than words, growing heavier with every unanswered question and unspoken fear. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Louis first noticed the message from Peter. Samantha had left her phone on the coffee table, something she hadn't done in weeks. She had fallen asleep on the couch, her legs tucked under her, her breathing steady and calm. Louis sat across from her, pretending to watch TV, but his eyes kept flicking to her phone. The screen lit up with a soft buzz, displaying a notification for an unread message. For a moment, Louis did nothing, frozen between curiosity and guilt. But the name on the screen was unfamiliar. Peter. His heart began to pound. It could be innocent, he told himself. A friend from work, maybe, or someone she met at brunch. But a tiny, insistent voice in his head whispered otherwise. He leaned forward, his pulse racing, and read the preview of the message. Can't stop thinking about last week. Let me know when I can see you again. Louis's breath caught in his throat. The air around him seemed to thicken, his chest tightening as though the words themselves had wrapped around his ribcage. He looked at Samantha, still sound asleep, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside him. He considered unlocking her phone, but it was password protected now, a change she had made recently without explanation. Instead, he leaned back, his mind whirring. Peter. Who was Peter? What had happened last week? And why did Samantha seem to have a new layer of secrecy wrapped around her life since the cruise? The next morning, Samantha was back to her usual routine, glued to her phone, sipping coffee, and brushing off Louis's attempts at conversation. He tried to gauge her mood, wondering if she'd mention anything that could explain the message. But when he asked about her plans for the day, she simply shrugged and said, "Just running errands." He spent the day restless, unable to focus on anything. By the time he returned home from work, Samantha was gone. Her absence was now routine, but this time, something else awaited him: a conversation with their neighbor, Mrs. Hill. Mrs. Hill was a kind but nosy widow who spent much of her time gardening or watching the comings and goings of the neighborhood. As Louis stepped out of his car, she waved him over from her driveway. "Good evening, Mrs. Hill," he said, trying to sound cheerful despite the dark cloud hanging over him. "Louis, dear," she began, her tone cautious. "I've been meaning to ask you something." He frowned, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" "Well," she said, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening, "I couldn't help but notice. There's been a man visiting your house lately. He's been here a couple of times while you were at work." Louis felt his stomach drop. "A man?" he repeated, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Yes," Mrs. Hill said, nodding. "He's tall, dark-haired. Drives a black car. I saw him going in the other day, and he stayed for quite a while." Louis's hands clenched into fists. He forced a tight smile and said, "Thank you for letting me know, Mrs. Hill. I'll look into it." As he walked into the house, his mind raced. Who was this man? Could it be Peter? His thoughts spiraled, each question more unbearable than the last. He tried to recall if Samantha had mentioned anything, an explanation that might make sense of it, but he came up empty. The house felt suffocatingly empty without Samantha there. Every room seemed to hold a piece of the puzzle he couldn't yet put together. That night, as he lay in bed, he replayed the neighbor's words in his mind. His humiliation deepened with the thought that someone else, a neighbor no less, might know more about what was happening in his marriage than he did. The next morning, he decided he couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. He needed answers. When Samantha returned home that afternoon, he confronted her. "Hey," he began, trying to keep his tone casual. "Who's Peter?" She froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for him to notice, before responding. "Peter," she echoed, her voice carefully neutral. "Yeah," Lewis said, watching her closely. I saw a message pop up on your phone from someone named Peter. Said he was thinking about last week? Samantha's lips tightened, and her eyes darted away. He's a bartender I met on the cruise. He must have gotten my number from one of the girls. A bartender? Lewis repeated, his disbelief evident. Yes, she snapped, her tone defensive. He's just a friend, Lewis. Don't make this into something it's not. A friend? His voice rose, frustration spilling over. Why would a bartender you barely know send you a message like that? She crossed her arms, her posture rigid. I don't know. Maybe he misinterpreted something. I didn't encourage him, if that's what you're implying. The denial only fueled Lewis's suspicions. And what about the man Mrs. Hill saw visiting the house? Is that Peter too? Her face darkened, her expression shifting from defensive to cold. Mrs. Hill needs to mind her own business. That man was probably a contractor. Contractor for what? We haven't had any work done. Why are you interrogating me? She fired back, her voice rising. Do you really think I'm doing something behind your back? I don't know what to think anymore, Lewis admitted, his voice breaking. You've been different since the cruise. You're always on your phone, always out. You won't even look me in the eye anymore. Samantha's silence was deafening. She turned away, grabbing her keys from the counter. I can't deal with this right now, she said, heading for the door. Of course you can't, Lewis muttered as she left. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house, leaving him alone with his thoughts once again. As the days passed, Lewis's humiliation deepened. The woman he loved and trusted had become a stranger, and he felt powerless to stop the erosion of their marriage. The unanswered questions loomed larger, and the image of Peter's name on her phone was burned into his mind. Samantha's actions had driven a wedge between them, but it was Lewis's own insecurities that twisted the knife further. Was he not enough? Had the years of familiarity and routine worn her down? These thoughts consumed him, each one cutting deeper than the last. And still, the answers eluded him. All he could do was wait and watch as his world crumbled around him. Lewis could no longer ignore the knot of suspicion tightening around him. Every moment Samantha spent glued to her phone or leaving the house with vague excuses deepened his sense of betrayal. Her defensiveness when questioned about Peter had only added fuel to his doubts. The man his neighbor had seen, the man Samantha claimed was a contractor, felt like the missing piece of a puzzle he was desperate to complete. That night, after pacing the house for hours, Lewis made a decision that left him feeling equal parts ashamed and resolute. He needed the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He ordered a set of hidden cameras online, choosing small, discreet devices that could blend seamlessly into their home. As the package arrived days later, he felt a surge of dread and determination. Lewis installed the cameras in key locations around the house: the living room, kitchen, and, with a heavy heart, the bedroom. Each device was placed carefully, the lenses disguised within everyday objects like picture frames and air fresheners. As he set up the last one, his stomach churned. It felt wrong to invade her privacy like this, but the thought of being played for a fool outweighed his guilt. For the next few days, Lewis avoided confrontation. He pretended everything was fine, masking his inner turmoil with forced smiles and casual conversation. Samantha, for her part, didn't seem to notice. She continued her routine of late nights out and guarded phone use, her behavior only stoking Lewis's unease. Then, one afternoon, as he sat in his car during his lunch break, he received the notification. One of the cameras had detected motion. His heart raced as he opened the app, the live feed revealing Samantha standing at the front door. She was unlocking it, her body language tense. Behind her was a man, dark-haired, tall, and unmistakably unfamiliar. Lewis's throat tightened as he watched Samantha step aside, letting the man into their home. It was Peter. There was no doubt in his mind. Lewis's hands trembled as he gripped his phone, watching the screen with morbid fascination. The camera in the living room captured their interactions, Samantha offering Peter a drink, the two of them chatting with an ease that stabbed at Lewis's heart. There was no awkwardness, no sense of hesitation, only the kind of familiarity that came from intimacy. His worst fears were confirmed when the pair moved toward the hallway leading to their bedroom. He switched to the feed from the bedroom camera, his breath catching as they entered. Samantha closed the door behind them, but not before the camera caught her leaning in to kiss Peter. A kiss that was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly real. Louis sat frozen, his world shattering around him. He couldn't bring himself to watch what followed. Instead, he turned off the app, his mind reeling with the weight of what he had just witnessed. That evening, Samantha returned home as if nothing had happened. She greeted him with a casual smile, her demeanor cool and composed. Louis struggled to meet her gaze, the image of her with Peter burned into his mind. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but the humiliation of what he had seen held him back. Instead, he played along, masking his anger and heartbreak with strained normalcy. Later that night, after Samantha had fallen asleep, Louis found himself staring at her phone on the nightstand. The cameras had given him proof of her actions, but he needed to understand the depth of her betrayal. He reached for the phone, his hands shaking, and entered her password, one he had memorized months ago when she still trusted him. The messages were all there, a damning trail of words and emojis that laid bare the truth. Peter's name appeared over and over again, their conversations laced with affection and desire. "Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. I hate that we have to sneak around, but it's worth it to be with you. When can I see you again? I'll do anything." Louis scrolled further, his eyes burning as he uncovered messages dating back to the cruise. It had started there, in the haze of tropical sunsets and free-flowing drinks. Samantha had mentioned Peter in passing, a friendly bartender who had made her trip memorable. But the texts told a different story. "You're incredible, Sam. I've never felt this way about anyone before. I wish you didn't have to go back. I can't stop thinking about you. Don't forget about me when you're home. I'll miss you too much." The tone of the messages shifted after she returned home, becoming bolder and more explicit. They arranged meetups, shared inside jokes, and even mocked Louis in ways that made his stomach churn. "Does he suspect anything?" Peter had asked once. "He's too trusting." "It's almost pathetic," Samantha had replied, her words slicing through Louis like a knife. The betrayal wasn't just in her actions, it was in the way she spoke about him, reducing their years of marriage to a joke shared between lovers. Louis felt a wave of nausea, his humiliation complete. He locked her phone and placed it back on the nightstand, his mind a storm of anger and despair. The woman he had built a life with, the woman he had trusted implicitly, had torn it all apart with a single choice. And now, armed with proof, Louis was left with a decision he wasn't ready to make. The next morning, Samantha acted as though nothing was amiss. She kissed him on the cheek, wished him a good day, and left for another one of her errands. Louis watched her go, the weight of what he knew pressing down on him like a physical force. The cameras had done their job. The messages had given him the answers he needed. But they had also left him hollow. The foundation of his marriage crumbled beyond repair. And as he sat in the quiet of their home, Louis wondered how he had ever believed the woman he loved was still the same person who had kissed him goodbye before that fateful cruise. Samantha's announcement came over dinner one evening, catching Louis entirely off guard. She had been quieter than usual all day, her fork moving idly through her food as if debating whether to speak at all. When she finally did, her words dropped like a grenade. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice deliberately soft, almost as though testing his reaction. Louis froze mid-bite, his fork hovering inches from his mouth. "What?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant," she repeated, a faint, forced smile curving her lips. "Isn't that exciting?" Exciting was the last word that came to Louis's mind. His stomach churned as his thoughts raced. After everything, her distance, her secrecy, the affair with Peter, this was the final blow. He stared at her, searching her face for some hint of remorse or guilt, but she only looked back at him with an unreadable expression. "How far along?" he managed to ask, his throat dry. "About 8 weeks, she said quickly, averting her eyes. 8 weeks. That would place the conception shortly after her return from the cruise. Louis felt his chest tighten, the timeline aligning too perfectly with his worst suspicions. His gaze narrowed, And Samantha must have sensed his doubt because she added hastily, "It's yours, of course." The words rang hollow, and Louis didn't bother hiding his skepticism. "Are you sure about that?" Her smile faltered. "What kind of question is that?" she snapped, her voice rising. "Of course it's yours, Louis. Who else would it be?" He didn't answer, his jaw tightening as he stared at her. The image of Peter entering their home flashed in his mind, followed by the memory of their texts and the damning proof of their affair. Samantha's attempt at indignation only deepened his suspicion. "I want a DNA test," he said flatly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Her face went pale. "A DNA test? Are you serious? Do you even hear yourself right now?" "Yes," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I hear myself perfectly. And I'm not going to raise a child without knowing for certain who the father is." Samantha's mouth opened, but no words came out. She sat back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she clenched them in her lap. "I can't believe you're accusing me of this," she muttered. "I'm not accusing," Louis said coldly. "I'm confirming." The next few weeks passed in tense silence. Samantha barely spoke to him, her demeanor alternating between icy resentment and feigned nonchalance. Louis, for his part, kept his distance, his focus fixed on the looming DNA test. When the day finally came, Samantha reluctantly agreed, though her reluctance only strengthened his resolve. The results arrived by mail, a slim envelope that felt heavier than it should have as Louis held it in his hands. He sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at his name on the label, his heart pounding. With trembling fingers, he tore it open and unfolded the paper inside. The words were clear, definitive, and soul-crushing. Peter was the father. Louis felt the blood drain from his face, his entire body going numb. The air seemed to thicken around him as he read and reread the results, each word cutting deeper than the last. It was no longer just suspicion or fear. This was incontrovertible proof. Samantha entered the room moments later, her expression cautious. "Did it come?" she asked, though she already seemed to know the answer. Louis held up the paper, his hand shaking. "Do you want to explain this?" he said, his voice low and dangerously calm. Her face crumpled, and for the first time, the mask she had worn for weeks slipped away. "Louis, I can explain." "Explain," he interrupted, his voice rising. "Explain what? That you've been lying to me for months? That you've been carrying another man's child while pretending it's mine?" She stammered, tears welling in her eyes. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "But it did," he snapped, cutting her off. "It did happen, Samantha. And now what? You thought I'd just raise Peter's child and never find out?" Her silence was deafening, her guilt written plainly across her face. Louis stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He couldn't bear to look at her any longer. Without another word, he stormed out of the room, the DNA results clutched tightly in his fist, his humiliation complete. The confrontation was meticulously planned, driven by Louis's need for closure and a deep, simmering anger that refused to be quelled. He had endured too much, Samantha's betrayal, her lies, and the unbearable humiliation of discovering that the child she carried was Peter's. This time, he wanted witnesses to the truth. He reached out to her parents, Margaret and Gerald, under the guise of a family discussion. They arrived at the house on a crisp Sunday afternoon, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Samantha had no idea her parents were coming. She was busy in the living room, tidying up for Peter's arrival, her demeanor far too casual for a woman carrying such monumental secrets. When the doorbell rang, she glanced at Louis and asked, "Can you get that?" Louis didn't answer. He opened the door, letting in Margaret and Gerald, who looked pleasantly surprised to see their daughter. "Samantha, we thought you knew we were coming," Margaret exclaimed, walking over to hug her. Samantha's smile faltered, her eyes darting to Louis. "But I didn't," she stammered, her composure slipping. "What's going on?" Before anyone could respond, there was another knock at the door. Louis opened it to reveal Peter, standing there with his characteristic arrogance. Samantha's face turned ghostly pale as the pieces clicked into place. "Peter," Louis said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the tension. "Come in." We were just about to have a family discussion. Peter hesitated, his gaze flickering between Louis and Samantha. Oh, maybe I should come back later. No, Louis said firmly, stepping aside. Now is the perfect time. As Peter reluctantly entered, Samantha's parents looked bewildered. Gerald frowned, his tone laced with confusion. Who is this? Samantha opened her mouth, but no words came out. It was Louis who answered. This is Peter, the father of Samantha's baby. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Gerald's face hardened, his disbelief quickly turning to anger. Is this true? He demanded, his voice thunderous. Samantha crumbled under their stares. It's not what it looks like, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. It's exactly what it looks like, Louis said coldly. He turned to her parents, holding up the DNA test results. This confirms it. Margaret shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. How could you, Samantha? How could you do this to your husband? To us? Gerald's voice cut through the room like a blade. You're no daughter of mine. You've shamed this family. Samantha sobbed, reaching out to her parents, but they recoiled. Peter, standing awkwardly to the side, looked as if he wanted to disappear. Louis didn't wait for the chaos to settle. He turned to Samantha, his voice steady and resolute. I'm divorcing you. I'll be filing the papers first thing tomorrow. Her head shot up, panic flashing in her eyes. Louis, please. I made a mistake. No, he interrupted, his tone final. You made a series of choices, and now you'll live with the consequences. He walked out, leaving her to face the wreckage of her lies. True to his word, he filed for divorce the next morning, ending their marriage and reclaiming his dignity from the ruins Samantha had left behind.